I want to bring in Mason Tvert, one of the architects of Colorado's Amendment 64 to legalize marijuana and the executive director of SaferChoice.org, which advocates for legalizing marijuana as a safer recreational alternative to alcohol. Mason, we've seen initiatives like this in the past. There was one in California that failed to go beyond just medical marijuana. And I'm curious what lessons you learned in the campaign you're running in Colorado that has you poised, it appears, according to polling, to be on the precipice of actually getting this passed.
Well, thanks for having me. Ultimately, what we've seen here in Colorado is an ongoing discussion about marijuana, about the fact that it's less harmful than alcohol, and about the failed policy of marijuana prohibition. And that's occurred over the last 8 years or so here, thanks to ballot initiatives. And we're now at a point where people are ready to take that step. They're ready to move forward and take on a more sensible approach.
This is the capstone on what has been a long trajectory of public opinion. I want to show national numbers here. In 1969, which was a time when there were some people smoking pot, 12% were favored legalization and 84% opposed it. And look at that. The only other graph that looks like that actually is marriage equality. Right. I mean, that's the only other issue where you see those kinds of numbers. We're now, for the first time, 50% for legalization, 46% opposed. One of the things I think that's interesting about the conversation you're having in Colorado is explicitly about alcohol. I mean, you guys seem really to be focused about making the comparison between the two and tying marijuana prohibition to alcohol prohibition. Why is that what you decided to go with?
Well, I think everyone in this country really recognizes the failure of alcohol prohibition. They know that it was ineffective, it led to organized crime, it caused more problems than it solved, and the same problems are associated with marijuana prohibition. So we're really just trying to get people to understand that marijuana is an intoxicating substance, just like alcohol, that millions of Americans choose to use and do so responsibly, and laws against it are far more problematic than the product itself. So by getting people to understand that marijuana is, a less harmful substance than alcohol, getting them to understand that we could be treating it more sensibly and taking it out of the underground market, taking the money away from drug cartels and putting it towards legitimate businesses, Coloradans and people around the nation are starting to recognize that this is a change that's very needed. You
also have a great foil in Governor Hickenlooper, who former life ran a brew pub, if I'm not mistaken. And so I think at one point you referred to him or Pete Kors as a drug dealer.
That was both of them. And, I call them like I see them. I mean, these are guys who are very prominent political figures who have made a living selling a product that is objectively more harmful than marijuana. So it's really hypocritical, but it's also it's bad public policy, and it's time for a change.
You guys have also put together a really interesting Strange Bedfellows coalition of supporters. I want to play a radio ad that is running in Colorado. Former Congressman Tom Tancredo, who is probably known best on this program for some of the really awful and obscene things he's said about immigration, and very conservative, very right-wing former member of Congress. He is supporting your ballot initiative. Here's the ad that they're running on local radio.
This is former Congressman Tom Tancredo, and I want to talk to you about a failed government program. It wastes tens of millions of our taxpayer dollars annually. It steers Colorado money to criminals in Mexico, allows the government to dictate how adults should live their lives. Sounds pretty bad, doesn't it? Well, I have just described marijuana prohibition, which is why I'll be voting yes on Amendment 64. We all know this nation's experiment with alcohol prohibition was a disaster. It didn't stop alcohol use in the country. It merely ensured that criminals profited from the sale of alcohol. Proponents of big government have duped us into supporting a similar prohibition of marijuana, even though it can be used safely and responsibly by adults. It is time to decide whether you want limited law enforcement resources going toward arresting adult marijuana users or toward preventing crimes that actually cause harm to others. It's an easy choice. It's why I'm voting yes on Amendment 64. This is paid for by the Campaign to Regulate Marijuana Like Alcohol.
You guys call it the Campaign to Regulate Marijuana Like Alcohol, so that messaging is embedded in the name, and that is by far the most sensible I've ever heard Tom Tancredo sound. I want to talk about the strategy specifically of pursuing this as a ballot initiative, and Bob, I want to talk a bit about criminal justice reform more broadly in that context. What are things we want in the direct democracy sphere, and what are things that we don't want in the direct democracy sphere right after we take this break? Talking about direct democracy in the states, some progressive ballot initiatives that are also going to be on the ballot on Tuesday and could have huge consequences. I think people have compartmentalized marijuana legalization in their head as this boutique issue. But if the state of Colorado legalizes marijuana, that's a huge deal. Huge deal. And people forget that prohibition recall actually happened in the state's level first. So, we could see the beginning of the end, I think, for it. The other issue, and this ties to marijuana because it's also a criminal justice issue,
right.
The 3 strikes law in California.
Right.
Bob, you've written about this really cogently for a long time, and the death penalty. And my question to you is, why, I think when you think about criminal justice issues, in the 1994 3 strikes campaign, you saw the danger
right.
of putting these issues in front of the populace for direct democracy, because it's very easy to demagogue. And in fact, the spokesperson for that was a guy named Mike Reynolds. Mm-hmm. This was the 1994 law, who had a horrible, horrible thing happen in which his daughter was murdered. Mm-hmm. And anyone who went through that would want revenge, I think, would be outraged. And he was the large campaigner. He was the voice of the yes on Proposition 184 3 strikes. And here he is giving his pitch.
Unfortunately, these people have given up their dues card in the human race. They're little more than animals. They look like people, but they're not. And the unfortunate thing is they're preying on us. And we have to get them out so the rest of us can go about living our lives.
Now, that's a really intense emotional appeal. Do you think the politics of the nation have changed on criminal justice? The fact that now, almost 20 years later, or that we're close to maybe seeing California undo that law?
Well, I think the politics have changed in California. I don't know how much they've changed across the country. But when you start talking about these ballot initiatives, I'm generally not a fan of them. And I think but we're in a position now where it's the same as with big money in politics. You have to fight fire with fire. And what are you going to do? Otherwise, you're just going to be overwhelmed. But especially, you made the connection between sort of these criminal justice issues and civil rights issues. And that's an important connection, because these are issues that are driven by passion, often driven by prejudice, and ballot initiatives, almost by definition, you have voters voting who don't understand well the implications, right. Certainly not the long-term potential consequences and stuff. So in general, they're very dangerous, but when you have a situation that's intolerable, you sometimes have no alternative but to take that route.
Well, I think also when you look at Prop 36, right, if you look at the amount of money that, the NAACP, the AFL, and SEIU has put into making sure that campaign is well messaged and is actually communicating effectively to voters, right? Supporters have raised $2.6 million in California on Prop 36 alone, and the opposition has raised about $100,000, right? So that actually creates, that's literally using the big money system, if you will, to actually communicate effectively with the public that is feeling the pinch when it comes from the state budget deficit. And when someone like Grover Nordquist, again, talking about strange bedfellows, has come out in support of amending the state's 3 strikes law, right? Because his whole argument is it's way too expensive.
The polling on this, Prop 36, just so folks know, it's at over 60%. You have 63% say yes, no is 22%. It really looks like it's poised to pass. Josh?
I think one of the things that's driven the political shift on this, and the number that really strikes me there, is that the opponents have only raised $100,000.
Right.
A lot of institutional forces that have previously favored or that have previously opposed reforms to 3 strikes, and there have been things on the ballot before that have lost to reform the 3 strikes law. There's a court order in California that's forcing the state to shrink its prison population. The prisons are overcrowded. The state is in a perpetual budget crisis. They can't afford to build more prisons. And so they have to figure out a way to shrink the prison population. And so groups like district attorneys and the prison guards union that ordinarily might just oppose a change to the 3 strikes law have had to settle on this as a way to do that. And I think that's why you see Grover Norquist. I think that's why you've seen a lot of Republican governors in southern states getting behind prison reform. Their hand has been forced by budget situations in the state.
Mason, my question to you is, Bob just said, I thought something interesting, which is this is the tactic itself or the tool itself is problematic, but basically you have to use it. In your specific case, could you imagine what you are proposing ever getting through the state legislature, or is this a case in which direct democracy is an end around the kind of interests that would block this if you tried to go through the legislature?
Well, you know, it's a little bit of both. First, I'd say anyone who suggests that the legislative process in the legislature is unproblematic is fooling themselves.
I am not suggesting that.
I mean, the fact is that, you know, a lot of times there are issues that the legislature should take up that they will not take up, that we need to get in front of them. For example, this initiative simply forces our legislature to regulate marijuana in a manner similar to alcohol. So we're not creating these very detailed regulations and rules in our laws by ballot initiative. We're simply saying the legislature must do this. And I think that that's what a responsible ballot initiative entails, is crafting it in a way where it is not tying the hands of our state, but it is actually just forcing our state representatives to actually take this issue on and represent the people on it.
I think there's a piece there too when it comes to ballot initiatives. There's two different opportunities here, right? There's one piece about really being proactive, right, and trying to undo some of the damage that we've seen. For example, in a state like California, Oregon, for example, you know, is actually poised to increase revenue by, you know, repealing some corporate tax loopholes. California has another ballot initiative to actually tax the rich, which is huge because it's going to fund the state's education system. And then you have other initiatives, like in Maryland, for example. There's not only a gay marriage ballot initiative, but there's also a ballot initiative that's on deck to repeal a law that the state legislature passed last year to allow undocumented students to attend state universities and colleges at the same rate as their classmates, right? So
Dream Act for the state,
Dream Act,
basically.
exactly, the Maryland Dream Act. And so what we're seeing in Maryland is, you know, the conservatives sort of have done their best to actually try and repeal something that the legislature already passed, that the governor signed, right? And the conservatives were sort of like, oh no, wait, this is happening. We have to do something about it.
Mason Tvert of SaferChoice.org. Thanks for joining us. I think the campaign you guys are running is really fascinating. Thanks for coming back.
Thank you for having me.
We'll be right back.